Okay. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to this first webinar organized by IRENA in partnership with the Aalborg University in the framework of a project led by IRENA on energy solutions for cities of the future, and especially a component focusing on the main success factors and options to facilitate and enable the integration of renewable energy, in particular low temperature renewable energy sources such as geothermal, solar thermal, water sources into new and existing district energy networks. So this is the first webinar of a series of 3, which will be focusing on strategic heating and cooling planning. We also have 2 more webinars coming in the next weeks, precisely on the 14th of May and on the 25th of May. We will follow up on this webinar by sharing all the presentations and inviting all participants and registered participants to the next ones. So we will initiate this process and continue this in the next weeks. And my name is Luca Angelino, and I'm Program Officer with IRENA, and particularly with the Country Engagement and Partnerships Division at IRENA in Abu Dhabi. We are focusing and started this work on the integration of renewable energy in district energy systems. Our focus is in particular on 4 areas: how to support national and local governments in terms of strategic heating and cooling planning, how to address some specific technical challenges for the integration in existing infrastructure, both existing networks and existing buildings, how to support policy making in the establishment and strengthening of enabling frameworks and condition financing, so on and so forth. And last but not least, how to address some specific technology-specific challenges for both solar thermal and geothermal solutions. And this includes both project facilitation tools as well as capacity enhancement activities. Today, we will have a number of experts coming from different sectors, academia, industry, and the public sector. We're really happy to have Mr. Gurbuz Gonul opening from Director at the Country Country Engagement and Partnerships Division at IRENA, opening the floor with opening remarks. And we'll have following 4 presentations by Jackie Ruja from IRENA, from Christian Holter, a technology-specific presentation focusing on solar thermal. We'll have Professor Van Mattisen and Niels Bertelsen from the Aalborg University. And to conclude, we'll have a case study by Paul Bonnet-Blanc from the Ministry for Ecological and Inclusive Transition in France. At the end of these presentations, we'll open a question and answer session. Here we have an overview of the speakers. And for all participants, we have 2 options to connect and listen to these presentations. First, you can listen through your computer, or you can listen by telephone. And if you have any technical difficulties, please do not hesitate to contact our help desk. This is the phone number. To ask questions, please, you can use the questions panel on your screen and type in your question. We will collect all these questions and channel those to the participants at the end of this webinar. And we will share the presentations via email in the next days. And also the recording of this webinar will be available on both the IRENA YouTube channel and on the website of the Global Geothermal Alliance. So we'll start off now with the opening remarks by Gurbuz Gonul, the Director for Country Engagement and Partnerships at IRENA. Mr. Gonul, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Luca. I hope you can hear me well. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone, distinguished participants of the seminar, this webinar. I would like to welcome you all to the IRENA webinar focusing on our work related to low temperature renewable energy solutions for district heating and cooling systems, which is organized in collaboration with the Aalborg University and within the framework of the Global Geothermal Alliance. My colleague Luca already underlined, the focus today will be on the success factors for an effective strategic heating and cooling planning. This is a crucial first step for the integration of renewable energy resources, such as low temperature, geothermal energy, and solar thermal into district heating and cooling systems. Cities account for 2/3 of the global final energy use and commensurate share of energy-related CO2 emissions. Air pollution, energy poverty, health risk, and climate change are some of the challenges associated with the current fossil-based energy systems, and this could increase further due to rapid urbanization. Indeed, more than half of the world's population today lives in urban areas, a share expected to rise 2/3 by 2050. In terms of energy mix, we can observe that the transition is taking up speed. IRENA's latest renewable energy statistics, which were released very recently, shows that new renewable power accounted for 72% of all power expansion last year in the electricity sector, with 176 gigawatts of newly installed capacity. However, when we look at the heating sector, although it represents the largest energy end use sector and accounts for over 50% of the global final energy consumption worldwide, it is seriously lagging behind. As a matter of fact, at a global level, only 10% of heat is generated from renewable energy. If we are serious about the climate action and the clean energy transformation, heating and cooling require urgent action, especially in the cities context. The decarbonization of the sector is both technically feasible and economically viable. This can happen with a combination of national and local energy efficiency measures addressing the demand side, for example, by reducing the heat demand with buildings retrofitting and optimization of technical building systems, for instance, and penetrating more renewables in the supply side. In this context, district energy systems are one of the ways to increase energy efficiency and scale up the use of renewables while reducing fossil fuel use in the heating and cooling sector in urban areas. Despite most of the systems are still operated on coal and natural gas, district energy networks provide promising opportunities for integrating low-grade renewable heat sources, including geothermal and solar thermal. According to Global Renewable Outlook, which is just launched, in fact, today by IRENA, the share of renewable energy in district heating may increase from 8% in 2017 to as high as 77% in 2050. Together with increased electrification, district energy can be a key contributor to the decarbonization of the building sector and to the transition towards a smart energy system, an energy system that integrates smart electric and thermal grids and can offer system flexibility. Ladies and gentlemen, given this background, the objective of this series of webinars and more broadly of our work on this topic is to increase knowledge of local and national policymakers on options and existing tools to facilitate fuel switch to renewable energy in cities through modern and efficient district heating and cooling network options. This work is held in the framework of the Energy Solutions for Cities of Future project. I hereby take this opportunity to thank the government of Germany for supporting this project through its international climate initiative, IKI. My colleague Luca already mentioned about the subsequent webinars. On 14th of May, we will look deeper into technical challenges and solutions for integrating sustainable low-grade heat sources in existing district heating systems and buildings. And the last webinar will be held on 25th of May, which will focus on enabling framework conditions, financing, and business models. These webinars will build on the ongoing work to develop guidelines for policymakers in collaboration with a group of experts from members and partners of the Global Geothermal Alliance and other experts from the district heating and cooling sector and will include relevant case study presentations from different parts of the world. We look forward to a fruitful discussion today and also your constructive participation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gonul. So we will now start with the 4 presentations for this webinar before opening the floor for questions by all participants. Just as a matter of introduction, we would like just to share a number of say data to illustrate what it was highlighted already, the fact that heating represents the largest end-use sector, and compared to other end-use sectors, including the power sector, we see this lagging behind. Building sector is a particularly interesting sector to be addressed. It represents, as you can see, a large share of energy consumption, all in all. When it comes to space heating, space cooling, and domestic hot water, these all together represents more than 50% of energy consumption in buildings, as illustrated and depicted by the Global Construction and Building Alliance in their report. As we know very well, renewables in this sector are really also lagging behind. They represent all in all less than 10%, and heating therefore represents one of the major contributors to air pollution and carbon emissions in cities. The need to reduce pollution and emissions are often the main drivers, together with, in some cases, serious concerns about security of supply. And these are leading more and more local authorities and citizens to look for solutions for fuel switch. DC heating solutions represent one of the possible pathways to decarbonize the heating and cooling sector. Traditionally, as depicted in this graph, district energy technology has been running on high temperature, especially using fossil fuels such as coal, fuel oil, and more recently natural gas. Renewable energy sources such as biomass and high temperature geothermal resources can play an important role in certain limited areas, but their contribution remains negligible to date. We see, however, a number of interesting developments when it comes to a gradual improvement in terms of efficiency of the building stock, the development of low temperature district energy technology, so running at lower temperature, which can be key enablers for a wider utilization of low temperature renewable energy sources, including from geothermal energy. And these may be otherwise remain unexploited. Other interesting developments and possible enablers are the increasing efficiency in terms of heat pumps, which can really play a key role as an enabling technology, and of course of thermal storage. So that said, I will give the floor to my colleague Jack to share a number of information with you.
Thank you very much, Luca. Ladies and gentlemen, as Lucas mentioned, we've seen an evolution of the district heating systems from the first generation, which were characterized by high temperatures and low efficiency, to the new 4th generation district heating systems, which are characterized by the use of low temperature resources, which have and these systems have higher operation efficiencies. And when we talk of the low temperature renewable energy resources, what we are referring to is some examples include solar thermal, which is basically the energy from the sun, which can be trapped using various technologies and used to heat buildings, or it can also be stored for later usage. The second one is waste heat, which can be obtained from industrial processes and also from cooling operations, e.g. the data centers. The other source of low temperature renewable energy is water sources. These include rivers and lakes, which the energy in these waters can be extracted using heat pumps and used to heat buildings. And also during the hot seasons, the heat can be extracted from the buildings and stored in these water bodies for later use. Another source of low temperature renewable energy sources is low temperature geothermal. And these are the most commonly available geothermal resources in the world. Now, we know that traditionally high temperature geothermal resources have been exploited mostly for electricity generation. But these high temperature resources are only available in a few places where there are volcanic activities. However, in most places, we find low to medium temperature geothermal resources. And a case of example in this is in China, which has the largest reserves of these low to medium temperature geothermal resources. Also, China happens to have the largest district heating network in the world. And at the moment, we are seeing the Chinese are taking initiative to use these geothermal resources that they have for heating in their buildings, whereby they are replacing fossil fuels with these renewable resources. We're also seeing where they're building new settlements and using the geothermal resources. The second one is that where we've seen that some geothermal systems have multiple reservoirs. The lower reservoirs, which are deep-seated, usually have higher temperature. Now we are seeing a trend where the countries have started to exploit the reservoirs, which are at a shallower depth and lower temperature, and through the use of heat pumps, they're able to extract the energy from these lower reservoirs, which are usually at temperatures of about 30 degrees, and they're using these resources. Yes, and they're using these the resources in the shallow reservoirs through the use of heat pumps to provide heating and cooling for buildings. Another thing that we're seeing is where geothermal energy is being co-produced in conjunction with oil and gas, where the water is separated from the oil, and then the energy in this water is used to provide heating in the buildings. Now, when we talk about developing district heating system that can be able to use these low temperature resources, we are confronted with different types of scenarios. The first scenario is where we have an existing settlement with an existing district heating system. Now, these district heating systems are characterized by high temperature energy supply and also the use of fossil fuels. And for us to be able to use the low temperature renewables in these systems, then we need to do retrofitting of both the houses so that they're able to operate at a lower temperature, and also the retrofitting of the district heating systems. The second scenario is where we have an existing settlement but without a heating network. In this case, we build a new heating system by which is designed to operate on the low temperature. And then on the building side, we retrofit the building so that it becomes compatible with these low temperature resources. The third scenario, and which is the easiest to develop, is whereby a new settlement is being developed. So this settlement the houses can already be built bearing in mind that they're going to use the low temperature resources, as well as the district heating system will also be developed so that it can operate with the low temperature resources. However, it's not a straightforward process. We expect to find some challenges. Some of them include lack of data, which is, as you know, data is very important when it comes to the development of these capital-intensive infrastructure. You need to have the data on things like demand so that you can project your cash flows. We also have challenges with some resources like geothermal, which we know they decline with time. And also we are anticipating to have challenges of financing and also of regulatory nature. And as we go on with the webinar, we are going to see how some of these challenges are being addressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jack. So we are ready now to have a technology-specific focus on solar thermal. So the idea of our series is for each of the webinars to have a technology-specific focus. Today we'll have it on solar thermal. In the following webinars, we'll also focus on more specifically on geothermal energy and perspectives for cooling. We have now a presentation by Christian Holter. He's the CEO of Solid and one of the world's leading experts in solar thermal market with more than 30 years of experience. And Christian will be providing an overview of the technology applications from solar for district energy, including some challenges and solutions. Christian, the floor is yours.
Okay. So please provide the screen to me. Here we go. Okay. You see my screen? Hello? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay,
Christian.
perfect. Yeah, so good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Glad to be here and thanks for participating in this great conference. I want to focus on solar thermal technology and its contribution to decarbonization of the district heating system, both in the current situation and with future potential and challenges. Before coming to that, a few words about my background, where I'm coming from. So I'm working with the company Solid. I'm personally founder of it. We are in business 28 years now. We've done projects in many places all around the world. And besides solar heat and district heating, which is a focus now, I do know several of you come of countries where cooling actually is a real issue and a focus. And just as a very short message, the two projects you see here in the top left, which is located in Arizona, and in the bottom right, which is in Singapore, are actually district cooling systems in the scale of several thousand tons that have significant shares of solar cooling included. So what we talk about here on heating works vice versa as well in cooling, for sure with some different approaches on the details. Now, jumping into district heating and solar energy, and my opportunity of entering that was actually a kind of emergency situation. City of Bratz, where our company is located, is second largest city of Austria, 300,000 people living here, roughly 40% connect to district heating with an annual energy demand of 1,200 gigawatt hours, peak load 530 megawatt. And the emergency was the power plant, which is 15 kilometers out of the city in the south, provided heat with a cogeneration unit by coal, by natural gas. And as there was so much cheap electricity on the market in Central Europe, the provider said, oh, this is calculated to operate at 5,000 to 8,000 operation hours. But under the current markets for electricity, we need to reduce our operations to less than 1,000 hours. So the business case doesn't work out anymore. And in 2013, the operator announced to shut down the facilities by 2020 and announced to the city there will be no more heat. And actually, just last week, the coal power plant there had its last hour of operation and today is out of work for all the future. Giving you a picture about the impact of that. This graph shows the heat demand distribution over the year. And you see in the beginning of the year, January, February, and again November, December, the peak of heat load demand. You see in summer actually very low load. This is just for keeping hot water operations ongoing. And in blue, you see the amount which came from cogeneration out of this coal-fired plant, which is 80%. Then there was a small share of biomass, 2%, something like 18% from natural gas boilers that were used for some operation on the one hand, and to manage peak management in winter on the other hand. and there was already a small contribution by solar plants which was installed in the city, feeding into the district heating. But as you see here, 0.2%, it's almost nothing. But imagine you are responsible for a city with 120,000 people and many offices, business connected, and you get the message you are losing 80% of your heat supply. Now, so in this emergency situation, the utility and the city and the local government came together and announced to form a working team. And so this working team was starting its work in 2013 to develop a full new approach for district heating. It was done in a public process, so it was a call of contributions, and all technologies, all universities, all consultants were invited to present their ideas, to present their concepts. It ended with 9 workshops, 150 participants, and 38 specific proposals what to do. Now, for sure, there was a lot of nice ideas which are close to the market. There were some ideas which are like a perpetuum mobile that don't work out. And so the Graz Energy Agency worked to systematic that and to analyze all these proposals. 16 of them went into detailed evaluation. And as we talk today, 7 of them actually are implemented or are under preparation of that. And with those, this 80% of lost energy will be replaced, and the district heating system will be switched to renewables. So we have a very nice template case of coming from 80% coal plus 70% natural gas to a highly renewable system. Not everything in one shot, as you can imagine. So among those proposals, you can imagine there was all the list of things we are aware about. And I'll give you a little bit of the outcome in the discussion in the city of Graz on the specifics of all these opportunities. Geothermal was off the table quite quickly. We don't have good sources for geothermal here. And so it was actually not sufficient underground heat available to run geothermal. Then there was a long discussion about heat pumps and potential driving them by renewable energy like wind. At the end of the day, the outcome is there will be a heat pump taking advantage of the wastewater from the city. There will be some small heat pump projects upgrading low-grade waste heat to usable temperature levels. But at the end of the day, those heat pumps will be in a percentage of below 5% of the annual demand, as simply there's absence of sufficient low-grade heat on the one hand. And I can tell you there was done all the studies with ground source, with groundwater, with river water, with the air heat pumps, all different types. But there was a second issue as well. The wind and the electricity we need to use to power these heat pumps today in Europe have 85% of fossil or nuclear energy behind them. And there was no vision to say how can this be a kind of green energy within a reasonable period of time. There's so much to do to convert the current electricity supply, including mobility as an add-on potential to renewables, that the vision how to provide 500 megawatt in winter as heat with heat pumps was simply too far off. So heat pump, yes, there's something happening, but it's not a major contribution. Next point, you see cogeneration. Well, this cogeneration plant actually today is still used a little bit. It is used on days when you have no wind, no PV, but this is a profile operated when you have high electricity prices on the market, and this does not match at all the heat profiles, and it's rather unpredictable for heat supply. So it is still used on a low level, and no one actually knows the future contribution here. It's definitely not zero. There's, I need to add, besides the coal plant which is closed down, they added a gas turbine, and this is now used for all this peak power management, but it's simply not sufficient as a base load for the district heating. Biomass. Austria has a lot of biomass, and we have a lot of biomass use already in district heating in smaller cities, in villages, that actually contribute to 50% of district heating supply in Austria today. But when you move the biomass into the big cities, you run into issues about the resources. And here's a agricultural chamber together with the Farmers Association, the biomass groups did a lot of studies saying how much is the additional potential we can take out of our biomass resources, including wood chips, including all other types of biomass. And the outcome was, well, that can contribute something like 10 to 15% to the current needs. If you go above that, you run into international dependencies, and you're not really sure where that can come from. Industrial surplus heat or waste heat. There was already some waste heat integration before this project started. Within this project, there was a very systematic screening, and actually a paper mill, somehow 10 kilometers out of Bratz, finally decided to enter into a heat supply contract. So there has been built a new pipeline, and this is already contributing something like another 15% to the district heating demand per today. On the other hand, it was clearly shown that the potential of integrating waste heat, actually it's going down because industry tries to reduce waste heat. Energy processes in industry get more efficient, so everything what is here needs to be taken, there's no doubt about it, but again, it's not a backbone for a future system. Waste to energy was quite simple in Austria. We do have a lot of separation. All the plastics, all the paper goes to reuse, so it's not part of the common waste. And in the remainings, there is not really high energy content, and this is already used in 2 facilities. So if we don't move to import waste from abroad or Italy or some other neighboring countries, it was not sufficient potential there. Well, finally, if we come to solar, it is clear there is a total mismatch between the solar radiation on the one hand in summer and the demand in winter. So it was very clear it is only possible to use solar when you integrate a seasonal storage. Otherwise, you get stuck by some 3 to 5%, which is the amount you need to cover summer. But if you build a seasonal storage, and there was done a lot of detailed studies on that, there is already under today's situation a potential of approximately 25% of the need. And in the future, when the district heating net is upgraded, has lower supply return temperature, this potential probably goes to something like 50%. And here I want to go in much more details now. So what I explained to you already in my last statement, you see here in pink the seasonal heat demand profile. You see in yellow the solar radiation profile. And there's evidence that in the real winter months, November, December until February, it's very solar direct input from the sun. But in summer, you can put a nice percentage, and the step 1 is actually you can build solar plants taking care on 100% of the summer load. But then you are, depending on the climate, depending on summer loads, you provide something like 5 to max 20% directly from the solar system with a small storage, a daily storage into district heating. If you want to move to higher fraction, you need to size it. You need to build a bigger solar system. You produce surplus in summer, you put that into a heat storage, and this is then the energy you can use for the autumn, winter, and even spring months. And this is what we have studied here intensively. So the results of the feasibility were the following. And what was our key benchmark for that? Heat costs here were seen based on natural gas. At the time we started the feasibility, the full cost from heat, including boiler losses, transmission lines, CO2 costs, were around 35 euro per megawatt hour. Now, the utility said if we move into a sustainable energy where we know we have no risk of changes in the energy costs, we can negotiate for a little bit higher costs. We can accept something like max 40 euro per megawatt hour. And with this target number, we came to a solar field of roughly 450,000 square meter, providing 250 megawatt real peak power. And this can partly supply directly to the city, especially in spring and autumn. And in summer, it feeds a seasonal storage that was sized with 1.8 million cubic meter. And then in the autumn winter season, the seasonal storage can be emptied in the beginning directly because you have 90 degrees C on the top, and you can send that to the city. And in the later part of the season, we actually decided to use heat-driven heat pumps to take out the low-grade heat and really cool down the storage to 20 degrees C and lower. And that system as a total provides roughly 20% solar share to the current infrastructure out of the solar field. Now, we learned a lot. What are the impacts for this project? What is helpful and what is essential to move here to economic and efficient solutions? And one very evident thing is the higher the temperature, the more difficult for solar energy as the storage, as a low-cost solution needs to stay below the boiling point of 95 degrees C or 212 F. So we need low temperatures in the district heating to achieve a high solar fraction. As well, and this is more true for sure for less developed places, automized control is quite essential. If people just operate everything by hand, it might be rather challenging in what they're doing. Next, it's always depending what are your competitive heat supply sources. If you have coal, it's often rather cheap, and you need to really calculate the CO2 impact. You need to calculate impact on air quality by the coal dust to be competitive. If you work against biomass, we have seen the solar system is quite fine usually. If you work against waste heat, it really depends on how the waste heat is seen in the pricing and in the costs. Another issue, solar heat needs land, because 1 square meter of place receives a certain amount of energy, depending on where we are in the world, something between 1,000 and 2,000 kilowatt hours a year. And you can harvest a certain percentage out of that. But at the end of the day, this is a clear need you have. So we were actually searching in the beginning to find places which are restricted for other purpose. You do not want to compete with city development areas where they want to build industrial zones, where they want to build new houses, city extension. This land is quite valuable. And so we were going for former landfills, we were going for water protection area, we were going for side areas of traffic, everything which is restricted in normal use. What we learned on that as well, actually it makes sense quite often to build a little bit a longer pipeline to the solar system, because then you end up in areas which cheaper land, with easier to access land, and the overall economics of the project get better. Another factor of success was if you build such a solar system with a seasonal storage, quite immediately run in a situation that the storage is not a solar storage only. It is a storage where you can integrate some waste heat measures from other sources, where you could integrate some power to heat issues, which you can use for peak load shaving. You can, taking another measure, as we have a heat pump taking advantage of the low-grade heat from the storage, this heat pump can be used for flue gas condensation of the already existing or new built heat boilers. So you get some other efficiencies out of that. And really, to make a competitive system is always not a standalone solar solution. You in a kind of drop there. It's an integrated solution combining the advantages of the different technologies together at one spot. Coming to the area and getting specific, the concept we had here developed had a space demand for the storage and the solar collectors of approximately 100 hectares. Just give you some comparison. The airport we have in the city has 3 times more space, 300 hectares. A motorway junction has typically something around 40 hectares. And quite interesting, the current generation plant with the cogeneration there has a space demand of 110 hectares. So if you compare the needs of solar, actually it is a kind of need in city planning, and it's a kind of political priorities. But we see other public infrastructure taking the same or even more space that is quite well accepted. And to get the right space of solar is definitely not an easy thing, and it's a real challenge for many projects. But if we have the right priorities on the political side, it's doable. Talking about area, we come quite often in a discussion what is the comparison between solar heat and other technologies in area need for generating a certain amount of energy. And the numbers I show you, they are quite different for sure for different places, because solar radiation is different, wind is different, etc. But at least here in Central Europe, you can harvest out of 1 square meter ground area something like 150 kilowatt with solar heating. If you use the same area for solar PV, you're a little bit below 40 kilowatt. By wind, you're in the range of 20. Biomass, you're around 5. And if you go to bioethanol and other things, you're actually even below. So that means in regards of efficiency in area use, this is a quite well technology. Coming from all the theory now to some specific examples, I want to show you 3 of them. What I'm talking about here has been done in small scale since several years. And the oldest project, which is a very nice lighthouse project, just to prove the technology with solar collectors and the heat storage under the ground, has been built in Canada in a very challenging climate near to Calgary. And winters there go really cold, very long heating season. And for a new development, a kind of greenfield, they built here a small system with 2,300 square meters of solar collectors, giving 1.5 megawatt peak load. And this system is operational now for 13 years, as far as I remember. In 10 of these years, the system was working 100% on solar heat to cover the demand of all the dwellings. Take that just as an extreme example of what can be done technically. It was a pilot, and it's nothing I would consider under economic operation, but I really like to show it as it shows the potential when the technology is really developed. Now, moving into Denmark, and we have seen this picture already in the opening slides. Denmark has taken the leadership in many of these projects. The small city of Vojens is using here 70,000 square meters of solar collectors with peak power 50 megawatt. To make 50% of the overall heating demand within the city. You see the solar collectors actually in the front of the picture. In the right back, you see the storage with a black cover on it. This storage with 207,000 cubic meters of hot water helps to balance between the summer sunshine and the winter demand. Finally, going out of Europe to China, a system that had been started up a year ago is in Langkawi in Tibet, so in China. This system is 4,800 meters above sea level. As you can see in the mountains in the back, this is the Himalayas. There are no woods anymore, there's hardly any biomass, and there are hardly any other renewable sources available. And the quite interesting part is this system is designed to cover every month between 75 and 100% of the heating demand with a solar array of 22,000 meters square. I don't have seen the actual operation numbers because this is now 1 year running, but in these climates in the high mountains, you have extremely nice sunshine in the winter months, extremely clear air. So these systems have a lot of direct heating support, but for sure the storage helps to shift between the summer periods, the winter periods, and as well cloudy periods. All these systems have been smaller. They have been supplying communities of several thousand people. And with the Bratz project, we made a step saying, how can these systems be upgraded in size? How can they be integrated in cities that have 10,000s or 100,000s of people? And per today, we have worked on detailed studies and feasibilities for roughly 20 cities. And this shows a major potential in regards of economic competitiveness, land needs, and technical interfaces. I specifically want to mention here that the EBRD, European Bank for Reconstruction Development, and KfW have specific programs launched to get these technologies moving and to support here the first lighthouse projects coming up. Actually, some of the Central European projects are meanwhile in the phase where they are prepared for implementation. So negotiations for securing the lands, permits, financing are ongoing, and I would expect groundbreaking for several of them latest 2021 in a totally new scale by a factor of 3 to 10 compared to the current existing systems. Now, you have seen these systems work under different climates and on different interfaces to the existing environment. In regards of different climates, when you go north to Denmark, you have heating demand a little bit even in the summer, it's much colder. When you go to Austrian mountains, same here. When you go to the flatlands here, there's no heating demand in winter at all. When you go to the Western Balkan countries, which is specific focus of EBRD, you have actually very short heating season, so you need a much bigger storage as you have a longer period. So all these systems have different backgrounds, but still certain patterns show that make sense, and these projects need to be customized today to match a specific demands, and then they make a lot of sense. The more the district heating nets are modernized, the higher solar fractions can be achieved. I think that's a very important statement for the future. We can already do certain things today, and 20% like we can do in Graz is definitely already a big step, but that will be a much higher potential in the future. And as a summary of this, I would say big solar represents a clean technology that can be locally implemented and can deliver significant shares of district heating independent from world energy prices and supply chains. And that makes it very attractive to local decision makers in district heating, as they need to do a one-time investment, and then they can get out of a lot of uncertainties and risks what happens to energy supply in the future. Now, on the potentials, to summarize, even today on some systems, maybe the solar contribution will be rather low because temperatures too high, land availability is difficult. Some systems will be even below 10%, max goes up to 90, but I would say something like 30 to 50% is doable in many places already today under competitive, economic competitive situations. We did, together with district heating associations, some studies saying what are national potentials when we use the knowledge we have gathered in all these individual feasibilities, and we move that on a European and global level. Austria, which is easy for us as a home base, we have said at the end of the day, out of 24 terawatt hours that are used in district heating today, roughly 50% could be covered by solar in a 50 years approach on competitive costs. We tried to make estimate as well on a European level, and for sure European level is very diverse. You have southern countries with hardly any district heating like Italy or Spain, or as well Greece. You have countries which have a long history of district heating, especially in the eastern part of Europe. We have the northern countries with extremely developed district heating. So all these approaches have different options. But at the end of the day, our qualified estimate was, well, something like 200 terawatt hours, 30% of the district heating demand could be covered. And we tried as well to say, what are the related investments to that? Well, that would be 70 billion euro. If you compare that with ongoing investments in the energy sector, it's surprisingly low as a 20 years target. We did the same as well with some Chinese colleagues together, and this is for sure a much bigger number. So I think there's a huge potential to go. We could add here Central Asia. We could as well add here some district systems in Canada, US. So there are potentials on a global scale which could be addressed. Summary, to come to the end, some real estate projects are in operation in small municipalities, mainly in Denmark, China, Canada. Several projects are in development in Austria, Southeastern, Eastern Europe, in large municipalities. Technology is ready to go, but at the same time, it is fair to state we will have some learnings, we will improve systems, economy and energy costs will come down even in the next years. Institutional requirements will be needed. You have situations like securing the land, getting the right dedication of land use. There's no experience today in public authorization processes, so there's a lot of needs in awareness and capacity building. There's a huge potential, and big solar can contribute to decarbonizing district heating significantly. Well, that's it from my side. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Christian, for your very comprehensive technology-specific overview on solar thermal. So without further ado, we give the floor to our partners in this project, the Aalborg University, particularly Professor Brian van Metjesen, Professor in Energy Planning and Renewable Energy Systems at Aalborg University, one of the leading researchers behind the concept of smart energy systems and electrofuels. His research focuses on technological and socioeconomic shift to renewable energy, large-scale integration of variable renewable energy sources, and the design of a 100% renewable energy system, together with Nies Bertelsen, a PhD fellow at the Aalborg University. Professor Brian and Nies, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity to share our work. I am here with my colleague Nies Bertelsen. I am a professor of energy planning and renewable energy at Aalborg University, and I've been working in the field of renewable energy systems for the last 15 years. I am one of the research coordinators of a research group called Sustainable Energy Planning Research Group, and we focus on the whole energy system. So while this webinar is about the heating and cooling system and strategies for planning heating and cooling systems, I think it's important to show a bit of background of how we work with this. We are about 30 people, 4 professors and 8 associates, and our focus area is technical analysis of smart energy systems. It's both on a local, national and international level. We focus on planning, strategic energy planning. We focus on geographical information system or mapping, and we also focus on suggestions for public regulation, local implementation, ownership models and market design. In our work, we have had a number of projects where we have focused on what you could call large-scale integration of renewables. And in doing so, we do hour-by-hour analysis, we do feasibility studies of the different technologies, and we do cost analysis and CO2 mitigation analysis. And Our main aim is to understand the full transition. So what is actually required in all the sectors in order to eliminate all of the fossil fuels. And this requires actually that we have some kind of long-term thinking, and that we focus on also creating some scenarios that can help us understand how the future could look like. In this work, we have developed a concept we call smart energy systems, and I'll just briefly introduce this to you before Nis Bertelsen will go into strategic heating and cooling planning. In the smart energy systems approach, we focus on the integration of all sectors. We believe it is extremely dangerous to only try to integrate PV and wind power in the electricity system. If you do that, you will end up in a situation where you will have to build very, very large batteries or very, very large facilities to, for example, convert to gas and then convert back into electricity. The storage systems for electricity only is very, very expensive, and this can create a rather inefficient system. Instead, what we try to do is we try to understand the full system. In most countries, the electricity demand is between 1/3 and 50% of all of the end demands, which means there's a vast potential when we talk about, of course, heating and cooling, as we're talking about now, and to integrate that, but also in terms of integrating transport and industry into the system. Now, what we try to do is we look at all the energy vectors, electricity, gas, district heating. We look at different gas grids. We look at cooling grids. We look at district heating grids. And in doing so, we find that the storage options, when we look across the different energy vectors, are much more cost effective than if we only look within an energy vector. Also, what we find is it's very important in all the sectors to look at the end energy efficiency. Now, some people may think that when we have enough renewable energy, it's not that crucial to insulate your house or not to waste energy in your homes or in industry. But this is by no means the case. In all of the analysis we have created going towards a fully decarbonized system, we can see that renewable energy is a scarce resource in the future. If we look at the integration of renewables, it is so that we do need storage options to be present. When we look in a smart energy system and try to integrate across the sectors, we're able to use cheaper storages. And here's a graph showing the price differences between different types of storages, coming from electricity to thermal to gas and liquid fuel, but also showing the efficiency of the different storage options. In this, we can see that electricity storage is around 100 times more expensive than thermal storage. And thermal storage can actually be both storage of heat, but it could also be not a high temperature heat, but a lower temperature heat storage, as we heard about before. We also see that gas storage is around 50 to 100 times cheaper than thermal storage, and liquid fuel storage is even cheaper. I will not go further into those, but I'll try to emphasize on this thermal storage. Some may say that, well, you're not able to use energy that you stored in a thermal storage in the electricity grid, but this is also not needed. we need to understand that we can store renewable energy in intermediate storages between the production and the end demand. And here thermal storage is an extremely good and cost-effective option because we will need to heat or cool our houses in the future, and we will need hot water for showers and cleaning in the future as well. So electricity storage can be reduced if we try to integrate the different systems. Now here's another way to look at it. If we look at electricity storage, a cheap storage would be a pumped hydro on a hill, and a very expensive storage would be a Tesla Powerwall. I would highly recommend that we try to avoid the Tesla Powerwall systems, and that when we use pit storage, we use them at the right moments. If we try to compare that with the thermal storage, we can have a thermal storage at the household that is around almost 100 times more expensive than a very large pit storage. And this pit storage is actually what we heard about just before in the previous presentation. So we want to go from electricity storage to thermal storage, but we also want to redesign our energy system, so we go from individual storage options to collective or societal or energy system storage option, because we can see that bigger is better at all in all means. So by doing this, we're actually able to create a cheaper options for integration of renewable energy. Now in this picture, we see an example of if we do build, redesign our system, what we're also able to do. In a series of studies that we have done called Heat Roadmap Europe, we have found that Europe is actually wasting enough heat to almost heat all of the houses in Europe. And of course, that is not possible to transport this heat to all the houses, but we are able to use some of it. And this is a case in the UK, a city of 350 people, 350,000 people. They have no district heating. They have a heat demand of 10 petajoules per year, and in the harbor there's a waste heat or excess heat potential of 35 petajoules per year. So while we're wasting heat, we're using fossil fuels, in many cases natural gas or oil, to heat our houses, and simply wasting the heat in the sea. And this is what we have found in the Heat Roadmap Europe project, that we're actually able to use a lot of this waste heat on a European scale. We can also use solar thermal that we heard about before, using district heating. We can use electricity via heat pumps, large-scale heat pumps. And of course, if we try to combine this with thermal storages, then we're able to also have a rather flexible system. This should be balanced, as I mentioned earlier, in a smart energy system with the end demand and with the end demand savings, in order for us to be able to reduce the needed energy, but also increase the efficiency of using solar thermal, geothermal, heat pumps, etc., into the district heating. In the Heat Roadmap Europe project, we found that it's possible to feasibly supply at least 50% of the houses in Europe via district heating instead of natural gas and oil. And now I will give the word to Nis Bertelsen.
Thank you very much, Brian Mathisen. So my name is Nis Bertelsen. I'm a PhD fellow at Aalborg University. And I will start by thanking all the speakers so far and all the participants here. I think it has been some very nice examples of potentials and of technologies. And I will try to add a little bit to this discussion about how to do strategic heating and cooling planning, how we can start to implement some of these technologies, how we can make scenarios for trying to utilize them. So my outline of my presentation will be a brief introduction. Then I will present strategic heating and cooling planning as made up of 3 parts. It involves identifying and involving stakeholders. It involves constructing technical scenarios. And it involves looking at the framework conditions, financing, and business models for these technologies. Then I have a few conclusions and summary in the end. So I will start by making a brief distinction, a very simple distinction in heat and cooling supply. So on one hand, we have the individual solutions, which could be an oil boiler or a biomass boiler, which is installed in the specific building and which the consumer owns himself. And then on the other hand, we have collective solutions, which is district heating, cooling grids, where the consumers are connected to a collective grid, a collective solution. And as we already have heard today, we have significant potentials in these collective solutions compared to the individual solutions. I think we have, all of our speakers have mentioned some of these potentials. But we need to do strategic heating and cooling planning to realize these collective large-scale infrastructures, as they are more difficult and require a more coordination between planners, between regulators, between different levels of government to realize. And that is what I will be talking about today. We also heard about this 4th generation district heating and cooling, going towards low temperature district heating systems. And I will just briefly mention that in this technological design, you need to look at both building systems, what is installed in the specific buildings. We need to look at the grids, the distribution and transmission grids. We need to look at the supply side, the heat sources and the cooling sources, if we look at the cooling systems. And as Professor Mathisen just have talked about, we need to look at how heating and cooling, it fits into the smart energy systems or our energy systems. And to combine these 4 aspects, we need to look at the planning and the concrete and specific implementation of 4th generation district heating and cooling systems. So what makes heating and cooling special? I will say that heating and cooling, they are local demands. We need to know where they're located because we cannot transport heating and cooling very far, contrary to electricity and gas, which is quite easy to transport over long distances. So this makes heating and cooling situated locally and often an issue for local governments. This also means that, as we can see, it's often been overlooked in national energy policy. When you look at different nations, their approaches to energy policy. And if we do not treat heating and cooling planning, heating and cooling systematically in energy policy and governance, then we risk two things. We risk to miss out on significant sector coupling, these potentials from the smart energy systems. And we risk to miss out on several renewable or very efficient heating and cooling sources. This could be the ones that we already heard about: solar thermal on a large scale, geothermal sources, excess heating, and so on. We can only utilize many of these using district heating and cooling grids to supply our cities. So strategic energy planning is a way of addressing these issues. So it's a way of addressing issues with the current energy supply and to formulate strategies and plans for transitioning away from this. And strategic heating and cooling planning it takes into account this local nature of heating and cooling. So we need to look at the local scale as well as the national scale. And it is a very interdisciplinary approach, because we need to both look at resources, energy demands, technical potentials, but we also need to look at the current legislation. How is the energy sector organized? What are specific drivers and barriers for moving these projects forwards, and what are the barriers that are limiting them? Yeah. So here is an illustration of the context of strategic heating and cooling planning. So if we have the specific project here, which might be located within a local government situation, then such a project have relations to, for example, the building sector, or a regional government has relations to the wider energy sector, the electricity sector, the gas sector, and so on, and national governments, and of course, depending on where you are, maybe the EU or other international authorities. And to do strategic heating and cooling planning, it's important that there is a communication and coordination between these different levels, so that the specific project level and the local government is able to communicate with the national government, regional governments, and that they are able to take into account trends and developments in the wider energy sector. But the other way is also important, that the energy sector and the national government are able to communicate and translate their strategies and drivers down to the local government and the local project level. So that brings me to this model here of key success factors in a strategic planning process. So I will say it's important to look at the scope and purpose of the project, identify the main stakeholders, and identify drivers for these projects. Look at the technical scenarios. How do we construct these technical scenarios? Here it's important to look at energy demand, to look at potential heat supply or energy supply. It is very important to look at savings and supply together. How do we balance savings and supply? And then based on this, we can start to establish some scenarios, some technical scenarios. Third, we need to look at the framework conditions and business models. We need to look at ownership models. How do we finance these often very large investments? How do we price the energy? And what kind of regulation is there and can help these projects move forward? And all of this together can result in a strategic implementation plan. So the first part, looking at scope, purpose, and stakeholders. So it's very important to identify first the drivers of this strategic energy planning process. And I believe Luca already mentioned this in his presentation. These can be they can be very different. It can be climate change, it can be decarbonizing the energy system, it can be improving energy security, it can be moving against local pollution, reducing local pollution, air pollution, it can be combating energy poverty, and so on. So there can be many drivers, and it's important to figure out which ones align, and if there are any conflicts between some of these drivers, and which stakeholders have which drivers. Then it's also very important to look at and find the different stakeholders. So who are the main actors that are engaged in this process? They can be industry that can provide excess heating, for example. They can be high demand consumers which have special needs. They can be already existing utilities, it can be water supply, it can be electricity and gas suppliers. And then it's important to look at opportunities to involve these stakeholders together so they can play a constructive role in realizing heat plans. Yes. So some stakeholders to consider. Here's a non-exhaustive list, but something that you can take a look at. So there is authorities, utilities, the investors, which can be both public and private. I will come a bit back to this. Knowledge producers, researchers, academia, the developers. It can be excess heat suppliers. Of course, there's the customers and citizens. And then, for example, it depends on what kind of technology we're talking about. We just heard examples from the solar thermal field, but geothermal specifics can be the geological surveyors, drilling experts, and so on. There's also a very simple model how to try to group your stakeholders, and I'm sure many of you know these kinds of models, and they can be quite effective. They can also be there's also a risk in them if you group stakeholders wrong. So I will say be careful with, for example, putting customers and citizens in the low power group, because this can provide a problem for you later. We have a nice example here, which will also be included in the project report, which will be published. It is a case example from Germany, a successful stakeholder engagement process from a geothermal project, which was made up of 4 steps. So first, they made a social site characterization. That's what they call it, looking at all the different views of stakeholders in the area. So views, what kind of fears were there for this new technology? What were the expectations to this new technology? Then they engaged in a more in-depth stakeholder dialogue, where they involved stakeholders more closely. They made an advisory group of the local stakeholders that could inform the process and the project. Third, they made a broad civil engagement process, engagement of the general public, where they provided a lot of information, resolved questions. And then fourth, and what I think is very important, they made a follow-up survey, where they looked afterwards, after they realized the project, what did the residents, what did the stakeholders think about the project, and what did they think about the process? And they turned out with quite high approval rates of this project. Then I'll move a bit on to the technical scenario building, and Jack has already showed us this figure where we can make scenarios for different types of developments. So it can, for example, be renovate existing district energy systems. It can be connecting different district energy systems. It can be new developments, and so on. So these 4 steps that I will present now, they apply to all of them. And I will go through how to quantify and locate the heating and cooling demands, how to quantify and locate heating and cooling resources, the supply side, then how to look at energy saving potentials, and then how to put this together to establish a scenario. But first, I will just say a few words on data availability, because it's crucial that we have good and reliable data. And this is often lacking, especially for heating and cooling. So heating and cooling demands, for example, they're difficult to measure because they happen in people's homes, and often they are not tracked and measured by either local or national authorities. For example, ways to improve this is to increase more measuring. It can be, for example, something like consumption-based billing. This can also lower the energy consumption. It can increase knowledge of the quantity and the demand and where the demand is located. Of course, this requires some investments in metering equipment, but this data is crucial to making reliable plans. It's also very important to share this data to provide some of the open access so we can learn from each other. And last, it's also very important that we know and have reliable data about our supply side. So what are the different sources which we have available? Wind, solar, geothermal, biomass, and so on. So how can we design our supply side? All right. So when we need to quantify and locate our demands, our heating and cooling demands, there's traditionally two ways of doing this. There's the measurements, which I just talked about. If we have this kind of data, it is really good. It's very, very nice to have the specific measurements. Otherwise, we have examples of how to model or estimating demands. And here I have two examples, one from the Peter 4 map and one from a hot maps map. Here we start with an example from hot maps. This is the heating demand in Budapest that has been modeled and it's available online. And here hot maps also provide the cooling demand where it is located in the city of Budapest. So these kind of resources are very useful to look at where is the energy demand located. When we look at the resources, we can also use similar maps as this, because we also need to look at where are the excess heating or where the heating source is located. Professor Mathisen already showed you some of these maps, but I have a few more examples here. Here we have one from the Peter 4 map, also of Budapest with the heat demand that is here. And here we can see where there's excess heating source located. So from this, it becomes clear that the demand and the supply is located very closely to each other. With this map, the Peter 4 map, we can also see that there's geothermal potentials in this region. So here we have both demands and supply located closely to each other. And with this, I will briefly give the presentation to my colleague Jack from IRENA, who will talk a bit about geothermal potentials. The floor is yours, Jack.
Thank you very much, Nis. So in the next two slides, I'm going to discuss about examples of tools that are available that the cities can use. First of all, to acquire data for geothermal resources. And secondly, on how this data can be used to guide decision making. As we all know, acquisition of data for geothermal purposes is first of all a very expensive venture. It takes time to collect this data, and also it requires highly specialized skills, which sometimes may not be available in most of the municipalities within their workforce to do that. In this regard, we see some initiatives by some countries that they're employing to enable them collect data for geothermal purposes. The first initiative is in Geneva, where drilling companies are required to register the characteristics of the underground through a database. And the kind of information that they provide to this database is information on the temperature distribution in the underground, as well as the formation, the geological formation of the underground. The second initiative, again in Geneva, this one is geared towards enabling using these locally available geothermal resources for district heating, and it supplements, or rather it complements the information that is already in the database. And how it does this is by including the newly acquired data, such as the results of exploration drilling, into the already available information. Apart from that, this initiative is also helping to coordinate the development of infrastructure, such as district heating systems, which are required for the utilization of these resources. When we look at the Netherlands, they also have an initiative where they have a geological database, and all the companies that are operating or whose activities are governed by the mining permit, they are required to register that information through an online portal called NLog. And when this information is availed to NLog, then it can be made available to anybody who wants to see it 5 years after the date of acquisition. Now, this helps in reducing some of the risks that are associated with geothermal resources, such as the risk of the resource. Next slide, please. Now, we're also going to look into how this data, once it's acquired, how do we use it to guide decision making? And we're going to look at a couple of examples. First of all, in the Danube region, we have a geothermal system that is shared among a number of countries. And through the Darling E project, 6 of those countries provided the geothermal data that they had. And this data was used to model the geothermal system that was common among the 6 countries. This data was then correlated with the existing settlements and also the existing district heating systems. Another example we see again is from Hungary, where they developed an action plan for district heating. And in this action plan, they identified the areas where they have geothermal resources. They related these geothermal resources to areas where they have settlements, and also they related it with the areas with the settlements that have existing district heating systems. Some of these district heating systems are run using fossil fuels, and they become candidates for fuel switch to renewables. Others have district heating systems that are running on geothermal, and they become candidate for further expansion. Apart from that, recognizing that skilled manpower is very critical for the development and exploration of geothermal resources, the International Geothermal Association proposed what they call the best practice guide for geothermal exploration, which gives the techniques that can be used for locating the geothermal resources, estimating the potential of those geothermal resources, as well as the characteristics. Now, these exploration techniques include geological studies. They include geophysical techniques such as resistivity and seismics, and also they include geochemical techniques. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much for that, Jack. So now we have talked a bit about locating the energy demands, as well as locating the potentials of energy sources. And now I will say a few words about how to estimate this, comparing energy savings as well. So following the energy efficiency first principle that we should save as much energy as we can, often we look at these kinds of figures, which are very useful, where we can see we should implement the cheap savings, the energy savings that are lower than the cost, in this case, of supplying heat. And this is a useful approach, but we have to remember the supply or the value chain effects of heating. So when we save energy, when we reduce energy demands, we also have a potential of saving in, for example, the building distribution systems, the conversion systems, for example, the capacity of our transmission and distribution grids. We will have savings in the production part, energy production, and conversely also in the primary energy input into the system. And this is part of what Professor Mathisen talked about. It's very important to look at the entire energy system, because when we look, if we only look at savings at the building site, for example, we tend to miss out on some of these important energy system synergies. Yes. All right. So now we can move on to establishing these scenarios. So it's important that you keep in mind the scope, and with that I mean, even though it might be a heating and cooling project, it's important to keep in mind how it fit within the wider energy system. How does it translate into electricity demands? What is going on in the electricity and gas sectors, and so on? And what is the time frame of this scenario? And I would recommend that you take a long time frame. You look towards, for example, 2050, towards a 100% renewable energy system. And you look at how does this scenario, this plan, fit into that that future. And then if you want to enable action, then perhaps do not make them too detailed at first. It's important that such scenarios, they are also able to, you're able to use them to interest your stakeholders, to go back to your stakeholders, see how do the stakeholders fit into these plans. And it's easy to get very lost in technical and legal details without having the full support of your stakeholders, for example. Here I have an example also from the Heat Roadmap Europe studies, which illustrates the balance between space heat savings and district heating supply. And it shows that it's possible to both expand district heating market share and expand space heat savings. So these two are not in opposition to each other, they go very well together. So it shows that the dark colors on the figure, they are the cheapest energy system. The total energy system costs are lower, and the total energy system costs, they include electricity sector, transport sector, so on. That's the entire energy system. And we can see we get the cheapest system by expanding district heating market share to around 50% at the same time as we save around 30% of our space heating. So this is an example of how to look at these at supply and savings at the same time. Then I have a few methodological points. We have been around a few of them already. The energy system scope is important, include the entire energy system to identify these potential synergies. Good quality data is very important. A long time frame is important. Make sure that the scenarios align with long-term targets. They fit into a decarbonized future. Then it's important we differentiate between socio-economic and business economic costs and prices. Taxation, subsidies, externalities, and so on, they influence the result. And we need to use costs that are relevant to society and not necessarily supporting the status quo, which might be in favor of fossil fuels. And here we have to remember that strategic heat planning, it is not business as usual, because we are trying to transition away from a fossil fuel system, which is the status quo of today. Then a few words on enabling framework conditions, finance and business models. So it is very important to be sensitive to the ownership structure. Who owns especially the infrastructure? How are heat and cooling priced? What pricing mechanisms are being used? What kind of regulation is being used? And how do we finance these investments? And this is such an important topic, as we will address this in a further upcoming webinar, May 25th. So here I will just say that these aspects are extremely important to look at. Here I have a quick case study from China, where they have addressed these three parts of making a strategic heat plan. So the scope and purpose has been, so they had the drivers. They wanted to replace all coal-fired energy production within the city. They wanted to increase energy efficiency in buildings by 15%, and they wanted to reduce air pollution levels. This was what was driving the project forward. Let's see here. So what was the framework and financing? They had a public endowment fund that enabled them to recirculate some of these funds into new district heating investments. This is very important when you start with, for example, starting with the low-hanging fruits, exploiting cheap excess heat or supplying heat to very heat-dense areas or heat demand-dense areas. Then it's important that you recirculate the funds from these projects into making new district heating investments. They also made technical scenarios where there was an interaction with buildings. They included energy savings, and they included wastewater heat supply in the technical scenarios. So this is how this plan involved these three aspects to come up with a plan. Then I have a few examples of district cooling systems. If you are interested in this, there is large systems both in Paris and in Stockholm. They're actually of similar size. They are around 500 gigawatt hours of cooling energy supplied each year, and just below 80 kilometers of grid networks. So there's two links here if you're interested in these projects. I have a similar case study as what Professor Mathisen showed earlier. Here we have another example. This is from Cologne in Germany, where there's actually excess heating resources that are higher than the entire district heat production in Denmark in a year, which currently is being wasted right next to Cologne in Germany. And with this, I will start to end my presentation. Here there is a list of links and resources for resources you can use in your district heating and cooling planning. And I will just end up with saying that strategic heating and cooling planning is an iterative, multidisciplinary, continuous process where perhaps you start with defining scope and purpose, you look into technical solutions and scenarios, you look into the framework conditions, but you will likely have to go back because this translates into new scopes and purposes. Perhaps new technologies are being discovered, new stakeholders are being interested, so on. So it's a continuous process. And what are the key success factors? I mentioned these before, but it is identify main stakeholders, identify the drivers in your scope and purpose. For technical scenarios, it's important to look at heat demand and good data sources. It's important to look at the heating sources, the resources. It is very important to balance energy savings and supply. And based on this, you can establish scenarios. And lastly, it's very important that you look at framework conditions and business models. Look at the ownership that allows you to achieve a high coverage of district energy. You use financing that can have long or support long time frames, pricing that is competitive, and regulation that promotes these large-scale infrastructures. And with those words, I would like to say thank you for your attention for now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed again to Professor Mathisen and Nis Bertelsen for their very comprehensive presentation about strategic heating and cooling planning as a very key step to firstly integrate renewable energy into district energy systems, especially low temperature renewable energy sources where integrated measures with the demand side, for example, the building sector, are absolutely crucial. So before going to the last presentation, let me just remind that all the slides will be distributed in the next days, that some of the examples which have been highlighted today will be captured in guidelines that we are working on and will be basically the final result of our project. And last but not least, we have already received a number of questions, but please feel free to ask your questions by using the chat pane you have on the right side of your screen. We will take the last minutes before 2 o'clock to ask some questions to our participants today. We'll now give the floor to Mr. Paul Bonnet-Blanc, who is Policy Officer for Geothermal Energy and Carbon Capture and Storage at the Directorate General of Energy and Climate, the Ministry for Ecological and Solidarity Transition in France. Mr. Bonnet-Blanc, the floor is yours.
Good morning or good afternoon to everybody, and thank you, Luca and Irina, to give the opportunity to have to give you a short presentation, a brief presentation of our case study in France. I must confess that as I'm a more geothermal guy, I probably, my presentation would be a little biased towards geothermal energy in the renewable heating and cooling possibilities for district heating. So first, I will make this short presentation around 3 steps. Where do we stand here now in France? Where do we want to go? And how are we going to achieve it? Just a little idea of how we are structuring things along with EU directive. Basically, we have 2 national strategic roadmaps. One is the rather long term, is called SNBC for a low carbon strategy. It set some picture we want to achieve in 2050, of course, carbon neutral. And along with it is derived a second one, an energy master plan called in French PPE, where objectives are set in a rather medium term, 5 years and 10 years, so 2023 and 2028. They are both updated every 5 years and based on the objective of overarching act, which is called Energy Transition for Green Growth, and was established in 2015, just before the COP21 in Paris. So that was a policy momentum in France, along with the worldwide perspective of set out in COP21. Of course, in this, there are some objectives related to heating and cooling, which focus, well, basically on reducing final energy consumptions. So you have some kind of percentage I won't too much linger on, because you know, they change recently, but that gives you an idea of what we try to achieve. Just going back to our national strategic roadmaps, you have to think that we run the exercise the first time in 2015 for only 3 years, from 2015 to 2018. And then now we have the regular pace of 5 years. So we run this process. The decree is supposed to be issued one of these days of this month, a little late rather than the target for 2018, but then it will be updated in 2023. Well, I will jump directly into well, renewable heating and cooling is let's say a particular focus is on the geothermal resources and geothermal capabilities of going green in the district heating and cooling in France. Right now we have 78 sites in France, and a big concentration is in Paris region. It's about 1.9 or 1800 gigawatt hour per annum, which is producing for mainly, but the majority, as you see, is 90% for district heating, 8% for agriculture, and 2% for thermal spas. And the objectives, as you see, is to jump in 5 years from 1.9 to 2.1 terawatt hour per annum. And in 2028 is more or less almost double this, which needs a great effort. So in our case, we need to, even though it's well equipped in France, in the region around Paris, we have really to dramatically increase the input of geothermal, deep geothermal in particular, energy into district heating. So we have, well, just to give you a better perspective of these figures, is to draw to have this chart and see that at the current trend, we really need to increase the pace of expanding geothermal energy for district heating. A little bit also just to know for the economics in France for geothermal energy. We have figures for 2014, a study by ADEME, which is the French agency for energy management and environment. The total budget for deep geothermal facilities for district heating, low-temp, is around 50 million euro per annum, which is that figure is for 2014 and probably a little increase in up to a maximum in 2016 and probably reduced a little bit. But that's the pace we have right now, more or less, to have the trend seen on the curve just before. I show you just on the slides before. In terms of a price, before subsidy scheme, it's around 74 to 99 euro per megawatt hour. And just to give you a basic idea, is the main competitor is still gas in Paris area and in some other, even though in Paris area the geothermal resources is well mastered. Now, what we have here is a scheme that is already in place for a long time, 2007. It has been renewed because it was very effective to address the wide-scale deployment of geothermal energy. We have a few things new as we try to expand geothermal in other regions. I would say just as a schematic, you see that it's not, as I said, it's a little concentrated in a Paris area, but we have new area of interest in Alsace, mainly where there is higher temperature resources. There was some around Bordeaux. There was some historically some district heating, not district heating, but use of mainly for agriculture, I would say. We try to also run for district heating. So let's say geothermal was, we revised the regulation of geothermal mostly from the mining code point of view to allow sometimes to assess the resource in difficult area. When I mean difficult, is rather that the geological context is a little more difficult to appraise than the Paris area. And for instance, in Alsace, we have the case. But that will work from some other areas. I will show you on the map later. What was in place for the long time, like I said, was a dedicated renewable heat fund, Fonds Chaleur in French, where you have basically two parts. One is the address one of the major risks for geothermal energy. The risk mitigation guarantee is the risk not to find the resource. So you have a short term which address the drilling part, basically not to find the resource, and the long term which look at the 10-year production on both discharge rate and temperature. So more importantly, the short term will refund if the drilling is not successful, and the long term will refund part of the capital expenditure you have if you have a discharge rate which was good at the initial stage and you didn't use the short-term risk guarantee, or you have a lower discharge rate along the year of operation, or the temperature is reduced, which is usually not, well, seldom the case. It's rather a problem of discharge rate along the operation. So that prevents, or that helps the operator to go into the business. It will reassure them. And then, of course, the backbone is the subsidy scheme for the investment, basically to reduce the price of the heat harnessed from the geothermal and put into the district heating networks. We have let's say a second part which fine-tune and enable the price to be affordable for the customer. On the customer side is a lower VAT rate, which is in place as long as it's not only for geothermal, it's for any renewable sources, along when the district heating network has 50% of renewable energy in it, and we will increase this level to make the lower VAT rate available for customer, just to push the operator to increase the share of renewable energy in district heating networks. One important thing that cost almost not a lot, it's the information and dissemination. We have workshops, regional workshops, touring France, which involve the French Geological Survey, the French Geothermal Association of companies involved in geothermal energy, and again the French Agency for Energy Management and Environment, where they try to disseminate the potential of geothermal energy. Like, just to tell you a few things, that the same is done for biomass, and biomass was very successful the last 5 years. But we see that for geothermal energy is not the same case. It received a big push in 2007, but since then the pace is rather low. We have also some other policy of fiscal tools being tested in a very short term. But the main thing is on the policy level is trying to achieve a nationwide identification of potential resources and try to do a matchmaking with existing heat networks, especially the one that relies heavily on the fossil fuel. To do this, basically, we have the data on that. At least on the right-hand side, the heating, the French heating and cooling demand, which is the map. Basically, that match where the big cities are. So you have a big spot on the Paris area around it. And we have also where rather dense Lyon and Bordeaux, like I said, and the part of close to Marseille. That doesn't mean there are district heating heating network in place, but that's also goes along with the identification and the need to deploy district heating. On the other side, we have, of course, a geological survey, and we have where we have sedimentary basin in Paris, around Bordeaux, and also in area close to Strasbourg, where currently the main development are in France, but you also have in this area. Sometimes we don't know. We know the general context, but we don't know precisely if there is a resource at good temperature and depth, because right now, like I must say that the information is coming from the oil and gas industry and the oil and gas appraisal that was done in the past decades. And sometimes you don't have any drillings, oil and gas in this new area, new potential area. So we need to do a potential a geological survey. What we know is, and that we have this done in I mean, the operator did it in some area in near Strasbourg. We need a 3D geological mapping. But on the other side, we don't know how to, and we are trying to achieve a better organization of project governance. And what is important, and I think it was highlighted in a previous presentation, is including data sharing. That's kind of important. And what's the task, especially the status of data acquired, especially through a geological survey and or some other means, how we can share it in a fair way. And also, if we go for this greenfield, is the current policy incentive framework appropriate? Because if we go in these areas where there is less operation, of course, it's a little riskier. So I think that's it. And well, I thank you again for the opportunity. And of course, I will be. I know it's a little brief and a little short, and probably need some explanation, but of course you will find my contact details if needs be. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Bolleblanc, for your excellent presentation about the experience in France. So we have collected a number of questions from the audience. We may not be able to reply today to all of them, but we will be using these questions also for the next webinars. Just one question about a clarification of what possible excess heat sources are available, and I can reply this already. We may refer to large industrial installations, the waste heat coming from industrial processes, from cogeneration plants, coal-fired power plants, gas-fired power plants as well. There may be a possibility also to recover and utilize heat from nuclear power plants. This was also one of the questions we have received. What are the safety measures in place to utilize excess heat sources from nuclear? We'll try to respond to this specific question in the next webinar. We also have other sources of excess heat. Excess heat may come from data centers. It may come from refrigerators in supermarkets being stored, for example, at decentralized level and reutilized either immediately or in another season through seasonal storage. So we have a number of excess heat sources that may be utilized in the context of low temperature district heating. We also have a question regarding the importance of energy savings, which are very crucial in the context of the energy transition in the building sector, together with district heating. The question is how energy savings can be addressed at a local level, especially when the local authorities have limited powers. But I would extend this question and maybe expand it a little bit to all the participants, asking how it is possible to you probably to improve the coordination, the cooperation between the national level and the local level, including in terms of heating and cooling planning, but also going more into the possible deployment of projects, how it is possible in 1 minute to improve coordination and cooperation between different governance levels, as we have discussed strategic heating and cooling planning. We may start with our colleagues from the Aalborg University, Professor and Anis. In 1 minute, if you can provide us with a brief response to this question.
Yes, thank you, Luca, for the good question. If I may start, then Brian can contribute in. To your general question about how we can improve cooperation and coordination between national and local levels, I will say, or there's many things to do. If I should touch upon a few, then I will say it's important that the national level, they provide the direction, they provide the necessary regulation, resources, and so on. I will say it's important that local levels, they receive a strong planning mandate because they are closer to consumption, they're closer to the building, so they need to have a strong planning mandate to carry out these investments and these infrastructural changes. They also need a high degree of ownership, I think, and they need good access to long-term finance. And then I will say the cooperation between the levels is very important, that there is a process that include some sort of feedback mechanism, so the local levels, they can address their issues to the national regulation, legislation, and so on, and that the national level also can address drivers and set direction to the local level. And then a brief word on the energy savings questions. I think that local governments are very important in realizing energy savings, as they are closer to the building. They have good knowledge about the building, or should have good knowledge of the building stock in their area. But again, the financing and these kind of questions are related to the national level. I think I will start with saying that. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe to Christian speaking, maybe adding from my side, Brian, it was a perfect summary. And what makes heating so much more difficult, we actually have 3 layers in most countries involved. It is the city, which is a direct user at the end of the day through its buildings. You have the regional government, which often has responsibility for the permitting and related procedures. And you have the national level, which is responsible for giving the direction, giving political frames, giving grants, giving that. And the experience we gathered is really you need to work with all these 3 levels in parallel and connect them and push your things, and then need jointly recognize the responsibility. And despite all these needs for getting climate things moving, I've seen in the past political reasons, what level was, let's say, the Conservatives, the Socialist Party, or whatever. So there were other quite stupid reasons for blocking the efficient procedures, and people need to understand the energy transition needs to be carried on together with a strong commitment.
Now to Professor Brian van Metisen.
Yeah, I can maybe supplement a bit. I think it is clear, because of the nature of heating and cooling planning, that there is some kind of strong coordination. I think from the local side, a lot of things can be done, even in many countries, without the national government. But it is really crucial that the local governments communicate with the central administrations on national governments in order to pave the way for better conditions to make these local initiatives. There are some structures regarding financing, regarding tariffs, regarding ownership models, regarding subsidies or levies that can really help if they are aligned to a more long-term strategy by the government. So I think a strong coordination here is needed, where the learnings on the local side are also transferred to the national level, so that the barriers can actually be eliminated from the central administration side.
Thank you very much. Mr. Paul Bonnet-Blanc, would you like to highlight or complement something you have already mentioned in your presentation?
No, maybe something that I jumped onto another presentation, and this is very crucial right now with the disorganization we get from the pandemic, is that especially for geothermal, it's rather complex, but I think for any renewable, it's a long-term difficult solution because it's not business as usual, as it was highlighted. And I think that I like the idea by the presenter before that try to make it simple at the first stage, because if you go too much into details, that probably will kill any attempt to improve any renewable solutions you will need. So really, it needs a stamina to impulse to pave the way of inputting renewable in district heating, and that's really on the political side, and try to make them comfortable at both the regional and national, even national side, even though it's because you have to think that there is a lot of competition and business as usual. When you have to make things quicker, it's usually, of course, easier, and you tend to go to these solutions rather to renewable long-term and that type of solution. So, and that's probably will be another challenge we will have to face to make district heating greener in a very near future.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. If I may go back just to complement the feedback received so far, in the beginning we have shown some of the major areas of intervention that we may want to touch upon, and I think a key one when it comes to technology-specific barriers, which may be related to limited capacity at public level, for example, for certain technologies, on how to address very demanding and complicated licensing procedures, on how to streamline administrative procedures, how to create a workforce which is required, example given on geothermal energy in some developing or emerging markets. I think these are also some of the issues, more technology specific, I would say, that may be addressed rather at national level, where the national level can support than the local level, making also some of the more innovative technologies more compatible vis-a-vis conventional sources. That being said, I go to the next questions, which is for Christian, and especially Christian, if you can briefly, very briefly clarify why does the solar thermal needs 4 times the area required for PV in one of your slides, taking into consideration that the efficiency of the thermal panels is higher than for PV. If you can.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. So that's actually, sorry to say, but that's a misreading of this slide. This slide shows the energy which is produced per 1 square meter on 1 square meter of ground, and it shows that solar thermal is actually a factor of 4 to 5 above solar PV. So 1 square meter in Central Europe produces around 160 kilowatt hours heat, or something a little bit below 40 on solar PV. And it's exactly as you say, the efficiency of the solar thermal panel exceeds the one of solar PV significantly, and this is then pictured by the use of area.
Thank you very much indeed. So we have many questions actually, and we propose to use some of these questions then in the next webinars, and it will be very useful actually to prepare those 2 webinars. Some are related, for example, to the risking geothermal projects. What are the major possible instruments? One of which has been already presented by France, which is a well productivity risk insurance system for the short and the long term. We have similar examples in the Netherlands. We have other approaches more project level approaches. Elsewhere, I may mention a project which is run at the European level called GeoRisk, where this topic is especially addressed. So we invite also the interested people to look into this project, and we also touch upon this issue during our third webinar when we talk about financial instruments. We also have questions about the possible participation of citizens, for example, and cooperatives in district heating projects. We also have questions about how we can possibly use solar, thermal, or other decentralized installations to feed heat or excess heat from the consumer to the grid, so the prosumer approach. We will address all these questions also in our third webinar when we talk about business models, regulation, and financing. So please follow us, and we will address as many questions as possible that we have received in the next webinars, which will take place on the 14th of May and on the 25th of May. That being said, I would like to thank our speakers for the excellent contribution. It has been greatly appreciated. We will distribute the slides in the next days together with the survey. So, and we also share with you information about the next webinars. So again, we really thank you very much for your attention, and please stay tuned. Thank you and have a good afternoon. Stay safe.